Most new gardens lose 20 to 40% of their harvest in year 1. Aphids colonizing the kale stems, cabbage worms hollowing out the broccoli from the inside. In a well-managed traditional Amish kitchen garden by year 3, that number can drop to near zero. That gap didn't come from a product. It didn't come from a technique. It came from a timeline. If you've been gardening for more than 2 years and pests are still a seasonal emergency, you don't have a pest problem. You have a timeline problem. And nobody has told you what that timeline actually requires you to build. Amish kitchen gardens are one of the clearest documented examples of a system most modern gardens never reach: biological maturity. They are the case study. The actual subject is the timeline beneath them. In Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, in the townships of Leacock, Bart, and Strasburg, Anabaptist farming communities have been working the same kitchen garden plots since the early 1700s. Not decades, generations. The strange part is that almost nobody studying these gardens expected the answer they found. When researchers from Penn State's College of Agricultural Sciences began mapping what made those systems different in the late 1990s, they expected to find special techniques. What they found instead was something harder to copy. The gardens weren't managed differently, season to season. They were structured differently, at a level you cannot see from the surface. I want to be precise about what the evidence actually says, and where it gets more complicated. Because the complication is part of the lesson. The question that actually matters isn't, what do Amish gardeners do to control pests? The question is, what do they build that makes pest control largely unnecessary? That distinction, between doing and building, is what this investigation is about. Here's the loop most gardeners are stuck in. Year 1, pests arrive. You react. You spray. You pick. You cover. Maybe you win. Maybe you don't. Either way, you file it under experience and move on. Year 2, pests arrive again. You're more prepared. You have the neem oil ready. You know which plants to watch. The pressure is roughly the same. Maybe slightly better. Not transformationally better. Year 3, same story. Different product. Same calendar. Here's what that loop is telling you. Every intervention that doesn't change the underlying system just resets the clock. You are not building towards something. You are maintaining a constant state of low-grade emergency and calling it gardening experience. The reason those Lancaster County gardens behave differently by year 3 is not that the gardeners tried harder or knew more techniques. It's that they were building something during those first 2 years that most modern gardeners are not building. And what they were building isn't visible from above ground. One thing to name honestly before we go further, this system isn't universally reproducible. Lancaster County has specific soil conditions, a specific climate, and a specific labor model. Multi-generational, community-embedded, knowledge transmitted by observation rather than instruction. What we're extracting here are the biological principles that hold up outside that context, not the full cultural system. The principles are real. The container they came from is unique. The question I kept returning to while researching this video was a narrow one, and I want to follow it honestly rather than skip to the answer. The question, why does the 3-year threshold appear consistently across different climates, different soil types, different gardening traditions, as the point where pest pressure changes character? It shows up in Amish kitchen gardens in Pennsylvania. It shows up in no-dig market garden literature from the UK. It shows up in permaculture case studies from New Zealand and southern France. The number isn't identical everywhere. But the threshold, somewhere in the range of 24 to 42 months, appears in systems that share almost nothing else in common. That's a genuine anomaly. Let me show you where the evidence leads. Most pest pressure in vegetable gardens is a downstream symptom. The actual problem is upstream, in the soil, in the plant's internal chemistry, and in the absence of the predator insects that would otherwise do most of the regulatory work. A plant growing in biologically depleted soil, tilled annually, fungal networks disrupted, short on organic matter, produces measurably simpler chemistry than a plant growing in biologically rich soil. Higher concentrations of simple sugars, more free amino acids in the tissue. The plant is broadcasting weakness at a molecular level. This has been measured. It is documented in plant stress physiology research, going back to the 1970s. Work by researchers like Jack Schultz at Cornell, later expanded in the field of plant defense chemistry, and it is reproducible under controlled conditions. Pest insects, particularly aphids and whitefly, are exquisitely tuned to detect that chemical differential. They are not randomly landing on your plants. They are selecting the weakest ones with a precision that took millions of years to develop. A stressed plant isn't just vulnerable. It is, chemically speaking, an advertisement. Now hold that, because it connects to the 3-year question directly. Mycorrhizal fungi, The underground networks that transfer minerals and water between root systems, that extend a plant's effective root zone by orders of magnitude, take between 18 months and 3 years to colonize a garden plot meaningfully. That colonization timeline is documented in soil ecology literature. The limit, it varies significantly by soil type, prior land use, and whether you've introduced compaction or chemical disruption. In a garden treated with synthetic fungicides, or in heavily compacted clay, that timeline stretches considerably. When colonization does establish, plants in that soil draw more minerals per unit of water and build more complex structural compounds, lignin, cellulose precursors, secondary metabolites in their tissue. Those compounds are harder for soft-bodied insects to digest, less chemically attractive as a food source. The plant didn't become pest-resistant because you sprayed it. It became pest-resistant because the soil became capable of producing a genuinely stronger plant. The soil doesn't look different when this is happening. It smells different. Earthier, something between rain on warm concrete and the underside of old bark. That's the biology working. It doesn't announce itself. The second mechanism is predator habitat. And this one may be even better supported at the practical scale than the mycorrhizal story. A garden in its first year has almost no beneficial insect infrastructure. Ground beetles, parasitic wasps, lacewings, hoverflies. The insects that prey on or parasitize aphids, caterpillar eggs, and whitefly larvae need specific structural conditions to nest, overwinter, and reproduce. Perennial plantings, permanent mulch zones, undisturbed soil margins, mixed borders with overlapping bloom periods that provide nectar from April through October. Those structures don't exist in year one. They are built, and in a traditional Amish kitchen garden, they are built with permanence in mind, not because the gardener studied entomology, but because the permanence is structurally required by how the land is organized and passed down. A first-year garden has plants. A third-year garden has an ecosystem. By year 3, if those structures are in place, the predator population begins to self-regulate. An aphid pressure spike gets met by lacewing larvae within 48 to 72 hours. Not because you intervened, but because you built the habitat that allowed something else to intervene for you. Research in integrated pest management suggests that in a biologically active, structurally mature garden, resident predator communities can handle the majority of pest regulation. The figure of 70 to 80% appears frequently in the literature. I want to be precise. This is a directional claim backed by a range of field studies, not a single controlled trial in your specific conditions. What practitioners across different climates describe consistently is that the intervention requirement drops significantly after the predator population stabilizes. That pattern, not the specific percentage, is what I'd consider reliable. In a biologically depleted garden, that predator buffer is close to zero. You are the entire pest management system. Every season, this is exhausting, and it compounds in the wrong direction. The dissenting position is worth engaging seriously. Dr. Matthew Greshop, an entomologist at Michigan State University, who has spent years studying IPM and diversified vegetable systems, has argued, and this is a summary of a position worth taking at full strength, not a caricature, that the beneficial insect narrative in small-scale gardening literature is frequently overstated. His concern is that the species diversity needed to provide the regulation being described requires landscape-scale habitat continuity, not just a garden border. A 20 by 40-foot kitchen garden surrounded by mowed lawn cannot, on its own, sustain the predator community capable of suppressing pest pressure at the levels being claimed. The insects need to come from somewhere. This is a strong objection. It is not wrong. What it changes in the practical architecture is the framing of the goal. A kitchen garden in a fragmented suburban landscape is operating in a different ecological context than the Amish plot at the center of a farm, surrounded by hedgerows, pasture edges, and woodlot margins that have been undisturbed for generations. The predator supply chain is different. In a fragmented landscape, your perennial insectary border has to work harder to compensate for the surrounding context. The habitat needs to be denser. The bloom succession needs to be longer. And your realistic expectation should be reduction in intervention requirement rather than elimination of it. The trajectory is the same. The destination is different, based on your landscape position. That's an honest constraint, and it's one the enthusiast literature almost never admits. This is where most content stops. This is not where we stop. Spraying pests in year 1 feels like control. Biologically, it's just resetting the clock. You are solving a short-term problem at the cost of the long-term system. Not because every spray destroys everything, but because reactive management trains your attention and your behavior in ways that make the patient structural work harder to sustain. The habit competes with the system. There is a constraint that rarely gets named. This system assumes you have the same plot for 3 or more years. If you rent, if you're in a community garden with plot rotation, if you move, the biological timeline restarts. The capital does not transfer. That is a real limitation for a significant portion of people watching this, and it is not solved by trying harder. Annual deep tillage disrupts fungal networks before they can establish. Beds that get repositioned, emptied, or heavily amended with sterile material each spring don't accumulate the biological complexity this system depends on. The permanence of bed location is not aesthetic preference. It is the mechanism. A broad fork, 7 pounds of steel and ash. Design unchanged since the 1870s. You can find them in woodcuts from pre-industrial German kitchen garden manuals. You push it in, lever back, move forward 6 inches. No inversion, no disruption. The structure below stays intact. That tool is the whole philosophy, in physical form. In spring 2021, I inventoried what I had actually built after 2 years of explaining these principles to other people. Permanent beds, yes. Predator habitat, almost none. The aphid pressure that May was the worst I'd ever seen. I stood in the garden and understood something I had known intellectually but hadn't yet felt. I had been maintaining a constant state of management and calling it progress. I hadn't built anything that would last a winter. Systems always have trade-offs. This one has 3 that don't get discussed. The first is the slug and vole problem. The habitat you build for beneficial insects, undisturbed ground zones, permanent mulch, dense perennial borders, is simultaneously ideal habitat for slugs and small rodents. In high-moisture climates or gardens adjacent to woodland edges, building the predator infrastructure can increase pressure from soil-dwelling pests and small mammals. At the same rate, it reduces aphid and whitefly pressure. The solution isn't to skip the habitat building. It's to design the undisturbed zones with drainage and access in mind. But the trade-off is real, and no one drawing you diagrams of insectary borders is usually honest about it. The second is the year 2 abandonment problem. The most consistent failure point, in every community gardening context, in every online garden community I've been part of, isn't year 1. It's year 2. The system isn't showing results yet. The initial momentum has worn off. Nothing obvious is rewarding the investment. Most people redesign the garden in year 2, reset the biological clock, and begin the loop again, without knowing that's what they did. If you are in year 2 right now, that context is the most useful thing I can offer you. Hold the structure. The third is regional predator mismatch. The beneficial insects described in most IPM literature, lacewings, parasitic braconid wasps, syrphid hoverflies, are temperate North American species. If you're gardening in a significantly different ecosystem, the specific species differ. The bloom timing needed to support them differs, and the plant lists in US-centric content may not be correct for your region. The principle holds everywhere. The species list requires localization. This is not a footnote. It is a significant practical gap in most of what's published on this subject. I didn't find the permanence requirement elegant at first. I found it inconvenient. I had plans for that corner of the garden. Beginner path, first 30 days. The first irreversible step is choosing bed locations you will not move in year 3. Not temporary arrangements. Not for now. Beds that will be in this exact position when the biology you're about to build has had time to mature. From that decision, the rest follows. Stop tilling below 2 inches. Surface cultivation only from this point forward. Begin composting. Not buying bagged compost, but building a live system that processes your kitchen and garden waste continuously. Add perennial insectary plantings on at least 1 permanent border. Yarrow, Achillea millefolium, fennel or dill left to flower through seed set. Native wildflowers where available in your region. Leave 1 undisturbed ground zone, a strip of permanent mulch at a fence line, a path edge, a corner that doesn't need to produce, where ground beetles can overwinter without disturbance. You are not gardening yet. You are building the conditions under which gardening gets easier every year instead of resetting. Intermediate path, 1 to 2 year plan. Year 2, extend the perennial border. Add a second undisturbed zone. Notice which pests arrive first and in what volume. This is data, not emergency. Begin observing predator presence, hoverflies working the flowers, ground beetles turning under mulch at night, parasitized aphid colonies that turn golden brown and go still, what IPM researchers call aphid mummies, each one containing a wasp larva rather than a living pest. That stillness is the system responding. Your job in year 2 is not to manage. Your job is to observe without intervening unless losses are catastrophic. The distinction between a managed crisis and a system maturing looks identical from the outside. It doesn't feel identical. Hold the structure anyway. By the end of year 2, document what predators you've actually seen versus what you're finding described in books. That gap is your localization problem to solve. Advanced path, 5 to 10 year climate resilient system. Year 3 and beyond, walk the garden in the first week of each pest cycle. Look at what's already happening before you intervene. In a maturing system, you will observe predator arrivals within 48 to 72 hours of the first pest pressure. What felt like emergency in year 1 begins to read as signal, the system communicating, not failing. Over 5 to 10 years, the advanced architecture builds toward what ecologists call functional redundancy, multiple overlapping predator species filling the same regulatory role so that the loss of one doesn't collapse the system. This requires expanding the perennial component, adding water features if your climate supports them, ground beetles orient to water margins, and extending the bloom succession so that something is feeding beneficial insects from late frost to first frost. A 10-year system in a zone that has shifted warmer will require reassessing which perennials anchor the insectary. Species that were reliable at your historic hardiness zone may not perform the same function as your zone shifts. This is already documented in the eastern U.S. corridor, where Lancaster County gardeners are managing species range shifts that their grandparents did not face. Plan the perennial layer for the zone you will have in 10 years, not the zone the seed catalog was printed for. If you are in year 3 with the right structures in place and still experiencing significant pest pressure, this is data, not defeat. Run a diagnostic before abandoning the system. Check in this order. 1. Is there a soil compaction issue preventing fungal establishment? A simple jar test will tell you your soil texture. Heavy clay requires specific organic matter additions before the biology activates. 2. Are the undisturbed zones actually undisturbed, or are they being cleared by a family member, a neighbor, or by your own spring cleanup habit? 3. Is your insectary border providing continuous bloom, or does it have a gap between early spring and midsummer when beneficial insects have no food source and emigrate? 4. What is your surrounding landscape context? Are you in a fragmented suburban setting where Dr. Grishop's objection applies at full strength? The system is worth diagnosing before it's abandoned. Abandonment in year 3 resets everything you've built toward the point that's immediately ahead. Lancaster County is not your garden. Zone shifts are documented and accelerating in most temperate regions. Frost dates have become unreliable predictors in zones that have warmed more than one hardiness zone equivalent since 1990. Rainfall volatility, not just drought, but unpredictable timing, disrupts fungal establishment by causing boom-bust cycles in soil moisture that interrupt colonization. Heat-stressed plants show identical depleted chemistry to nutrient-stressed plants. Simple sugars rise, secondary metabolites fall. The same pest selection mechanics apply in drought, but soil biology alone cannot compensate for persistent heat stress. Water strategy, mulch depth, water retention in soil structure, drought-tolerant species substitutions, becomes a co-equal factor in a warming system, not a footnote. Check your current zone against its 1990 classification. If it has shifted, your 10-year perennial plan should be designed for the zone you're likely to occupy in 2035, not the zone you're in today. Here is the reframe that changes how you read a pest problem. Pest pressure is not a sign that your garden is under attack. It is a signal about the maturity of your system. High pest pressure in year 1 is expected. The biological infrastructure hasn't had time to build. Persistent high pressure in year 3 means the infrastructure still isn't in place. It is a diagnostic, not a failure. One thing this framing doesn't solve. Some pest pressure is present in every functioning ecosystem. The goal isn't a pest-free garden. That doesn't exist in nature, and it isn't what traditional Amish kitchen gardens actually have. The goal is a system where pest pressure stays below meaningful threshold, without requiring your constant intervention. That's a different and more honest target than most gardening content offers you. The Amish gardener in Leacock Township, who has low pest pressure in year 3, didn't win a battle. She built a system that doesn't need to fight at full capacity every season. Those are two completely different projects. Most gardening content trains you for the battle. This channel is interested in the system. The gardener who has tended the same plot for 3 years and still reaches for the spray bottle every June has not failed. They've been solving a different problem than they thought, and no one named the actual problem, which is that management and building are not the same activity, and one of them compounds. The structures that change what year 3 looks like are not complicated. Permanent beds, undisturbed margins, perennial bloom succession. Stop tilling deep. The work in years 1 and 2 looks unrewarding because the reward is not yet present. It is being assembled underground, in networks you cannot see, by organisms you didn't plant. Most gardens reset every spring. A mature garden compounds. The question is which one you're building. Run your math.